Well, hello everyone, my name is Pavo, and today we're taking a look at the Ramstein meeting, the 25th meeting in this format, and possibly the last one. It is already the last one during Biden's administration in the White House, and nobody knows what will happen when President-elect Trump will take office already this month. We had an insightful and great conversation with Mr. Stephen Pifer, the third ambassador of the United States to independent Ukraine. Okay, let's go. And there's plenty to discuss. The first question is about the final Ramstein meeting, as we can say, during the Biden administration, which will take place tomorrow. What are the expectations for the strategy of defense of Ukraine, in your opinion?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that will happen tomorrow. One is Secretary of Defense Austin will be there, and he will outline, I think, the final provision of assistance under the Biden administration. As you probably know, the Biden administration over the last couple of months has tried to make sure it is allocating and spending as much of the funds that were all authorized by Congress as possible, given uncertainties about what the Trump administration might do. So I think that's one question. And then I think a second question that, of course, even though the Biden administration ends on January 20th, Secretary Austin will be discussing with other NATO members what are the plans looking at supporting Ukraine out through 2027.
Well, to be honest, I'm a little bit worried about what will come next because people are saying the last Ramstein, people in the US allegate that this is the end of the Ukraine support, direct military and budgetary support when Trump comes into power. Should we be worried about the lack of means for defense after this final Ramstein meeting?
Well, what U.S. government officials say is that with the surge in American assistance that's happening now, Ukraine will, for some time to come into 2025, have sufficient munitions and arms to continue the fight. But of course, at some point that does run out, at least in terms of assistance from the United States. And I have to say, I also am concerned. I do not know what the Trump administration will do. Over the last year and a half, Mr. Trump has not been a supporter of American assistance to Ukraine. I think some of his comments, when he said that he could end the war in 24 hours, that suggested to me at least that he does not understand the complexities of this war. But it looks like he may have moderated his tone a little bit. He's no longer talking about solving the war in 24 hours. And I think he may be coming to recognize, at least I hope so, that if Ukraine loses because of lack of American support, that's going to be his responsibility. And perhaps he does not want to bear that responsibility. We'll have to see.
Well, if we talk and see about what is happening with Mr. Trump's statements yesterday, all this joke about Canada that is going for far too long, about Greenland, the Panama question that is rising, and some people support it on Twitter. These are direct and disturbing calls. Should we be worried about that, concerning that Ukraine support here and let's join Canada here?
I just regard that as some of the unfortunate silliness and nonsense that we're all going to face when Mr. Trump comes back to the White House. Denmark is an ally. For purposes of national security, the United States has had the access to the bases it needs in Greenland. So I just think this is nonsense. And I don't expect any serious effort made to push it. Just as 5 years ago, he suggested he would like to buy Greenland, and Denmark said no, Greenland said no, and the idea quickly faded away. But unfortunately, we're going to have this kind of nonsense returning to the White House. I wish it were otherwise.
So we can consider this some kind of advertising move to keep one's attention before the inauguration, probably.
Perhaps I have long given up trying to figure out exactly how Mr. Trump's mind works.
Well, I hope that there will be no Greenland sell to the US and other conflicts inside the NATO alliance. And the Arctic right now is dominated by the Russian North Fleet, and any involvement of United States in Greenland more will force these two powers, Russia and US, to collide there in that region. So basically, what Mr. Trump is saying that he wants to move into the Russian-dominated area, which is the opposite of this peacekeeping rhetoric about Ukraine, which he's talking.
Yeah, but again, I think militarily, the United States has what it needs in Greenland. Actually, acquiring Greenland would not change that.
Okay, thank you very much. And about again about the new U.S. Policy, Mr. Trump has said that Ukraine will never be in NATO. That's out of the question. But we have the answer from Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, that Patriot air defense systems could be used only by NATO allies, and F-16 could be transferred only to allies. Is that possible that today we say about Ukraine never in NATO, but in a month, in a year, in a decade, this will change?
I think views can change. I mean, I look at it from the perspective of American national security interest. And the United States, for more than 7 decades, has said that a stable and secure Europe is a vital American security interest. I'm not sure if Trump agrees with that, but I think key people around him, I think his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, would agree. I think his national security advisor would agree. It's hard for me to see that you have a stable and secure Europe now without a stable and secure Ukraine. If there's continuing tension, continuing war, that's going to be instability, insecurity in Europe. And so the question to my mind is, how in the long term do you ensure a secure Ukraine? And this is where it seems to me the logical answer is Ukraine and NATO. Now, defining exactly how you get Ukraine and NATO is a difficult question. But it seems to me that any arrangement after the conflict, by itself proves a point of instability and basically leaves Ukraine open to renewed attack by Russia whenever the Kremlin decides to do so. So the question is going to be, are we in the West serious about promoting stability and security in Europe? Again, at this point, I don't think Mr. Trump is there, but I think there are some people around him who can understand this, and hopefully they will have some influence on his thinking.
Okay, but if we talk about all these security guarantee topic, some people are strongly against Ukraine's participation in NATO. We see that Vladimir Putin will never accept that this kind of a sentence coming from different cabinets, from different leaders. Is there a blank chance or a possibility of organizing a smaller European or Eastern European security defensive alliance with NATO members and possibly non-NATO members like Moldova and Ukraine?
Well, I think that there's always that kind of possibility, but I think when you're talking about that, you're talking about a security guarantee in which other countries say, if Ukraine is attacked again, we are prepared to send our military forces to Ukraine's defense. Right now, although there are a lot of agreements, bilateral agreements on security commitments, as far as I know, not a single one of those agreements has that kind of element, where a country says, if Ukraine is attacked again in the future, we will come to Ukraine's defense. Some countries, I think, are thinking about that. But again, most of the countries that would be thinking about would be NATO countries. And my guess is that they would be far more comfortable doing as part of a NATO commitment. But again, that requires that there is consensus among NATO members. And at this point, I don't think you have all NATO members supporting that idea. Although I will say that from what I can see, bear in mind, I'm watching from the outside, but I think that there are more members of NATO now prepared to support Ukrainian membership in the alliance than there were before 2022. Because I think more NATO members now understand that Ukraine's security matters to Europe, and that an insecure Ukraine is going to mean an insecure Ukraine. An insecure Ukraine will mean an insecure Europe.
Okay, and what do you think about the idea of strengthening the alliance with Ukraine's troops after the war, possibly stationing them in the Baltic countries, and maybe Belarus will have a change in government with the legitimate government coming into power, and self-proclaimed Lukashenko finally retiring and going somewhere else. We are not talking about some kind of a revolution, but over peaceful retirement.
Yeah, well, I don't want to speculate about the particulars, but people ought to bear in mind that Ukraine in NATO would bring a very powerful, proven, tested military to NATO security ranks. So Ukraine would not just be a consumer of security; it could contribute to alliance security, and that's a point that I think more people now recognize.
Yes, and the Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden, they are investing in Ukraine's missile program, missile industry, because Ukrainian missiles are cheaper than NATO analogs, and Russia exactly wants Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, because of those Soviet time missile industry, and most of Ukrainian missiles that were used to carry nuclear strikes, they were like remade into civilian space missiles in Dnipro. And possibly Ukraine can bring in cheap missiles and cheaper equipment for a mass production in a case of an open confrontation with the same mass product producing Russia. Uh, what do you think on that?
Uh, I think that's a good idea, but I also think it's in the near term, while this war is continuing, it is good that there are allies investing in Ukraine's defense industry because I believe, for example, Washington has made a mistake over the last year in limiting the use by the Ukrainian military of U.S. provided ATACMS missiles and restricting them. Now there is some use allowed to target military targets inside Russia, but limitations remain. However, if Ukraine, its own defense industry produces rockets, then Ukraine doesn't have to get permission from the United States or any other provider of Western weapons. It can use those as it sees fit. And I think to date we've seen Ukraine make use of its own capabilities in a fairly efficient and militarily appropriate way to hit targets in Russia.
Well, and that always makes the relief on NATO countries and United States for not needing to bring more ATACMS missiles in Ukraine, which they can use themselves in case of a conflict, and strengthening the defense of the entire eastern flank of this European security. And next, what we have also is that the glide bomb strikes, they have really decreased so far by statistics made by Ukrainian and international OSINT researchers by 3 times. The strikes with glide bombs, which cannot be intercepted by any way, have decreased because Russians are afraid that their Su-34 fighter bombers will be hit by ATACMS missiles in the nearest airfields on the front line. So we see already the decrease in these strikes, which cannot be stopped at the moment. And why I am telling you about this? Because they are really a horrible weapon. Today, a strike in Zaporizhia have killed 13 people and injured tens and tens more just in the center of the industrial city. I've seen the horrible footage. And this bomb was launched from a military airplane, which can be intercepted only by Patriot systems, which have a long range, or it can be destroyed on the airfield back in Russia. So that is important.
This was why a lot of us were arguing, a year ago that we should allow the Ukrainians to use ATACMS missiles to strike targets inside Russia. Again, I think it was, generally, I think the Biden administration has done a good job of supporting Ukraine. But going back to February of 2022, they've always said they've had two goals. One is to support Ukraine, and the other is to avoid a direct military fight between NATO and Russia. Those are, to my mind, the right two goals. But where I would have been critical of the administration is that balancing those goals, they've been overly cautious, more cautious than they have needed to be. And unfortunately, I think that has probably undercut some of the Ukrainian ability to defend itself over the past year.
Yeah, and right now we have a relentless and ruthless attack on the Ukrainian front line in Donbass, in the Donetsk region, where Russians advance with tremendous losses daily. They do not count the dead, the wounded. They do not take them out, and unfortunately, they are making progress. It's their tactic, which has been in use since World War II, as far as I remember. But
Yeah.
again, we have their failure in the Kursk region. Yet again, Ukrainian forces have advanced as far as 8 kilometers deep during one day of the offensive 2.0 in the Kursk region, which is, according to General Ben Hodges, as I have read today, demonstrates the weakness that Russia can fight only on one front, directing a mass of troops, and it is really vulnerable on all other fronts. Hit where you would like, and yeah, it will collapse.
Yeah, no, there's been this narrative that has taken hold, I think, in large parts of Western media that Russia is winning, Ukraine is losing, and it's only a matter of time. And I don't think that's correct. I mean, certainly this is a difficult period for Ukraine. I'm not saying that Ukraine is winning the war now, but the idea that the Russians are making huge progress, just a couple of points. One is, I think most analysts would say that in October, November, December, each of those months were probably as successful for the Russian army as any months in the last 2 years in terms of occupying territory of Ukraine. I think in each of those months, the Russian army occupied about 225 square miles. I'm not sure how many square kilometers that is, but 225 square miles of Ukrainian territory. By my calculation, that is 1/1000th of Ukraine's territory. So it's not like they're making huge progress in terms of territorial gains. And moreover, as you said, they've done it at immense personal manpower costs. I mean, the estimates now from the British Ministry of Defense are over 700,000 Russian troops killed and wounded, of which maybe 150 to 200,000 have been killed. Take that number, 700,000, go back to January of 2022. If you look at the total active duty manpower of the Russian military, and I'm not talking about just the army, I'm talking about the army, the Air Force, the Navy, total manpower, it was 1.1 million. Those are huge losses. And what I understand now from Western sources is that roughly the Russians are losing 1,500 soldiers a day. That is more than the replacement rate. And so at some point, Vladimir Putin may face a decision he would really not like to face, which is, does he have to mobilize people, particularly ethnic Russians in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, to continue this war? And the manpower losses may drive him to that point. And I think, quite frankly, the sooner the better, because that may begin to affect calculations in Moscow about whether to continue the fighting.
Well, the mobilization process in such cities will raise questions, a lot of unpleasant questions. What is happening with the war? Why the war was started in the first place? What were the goals and what to fight for? But that is in the best scenario. In the worst case scenario, Russians just would go in and mobilize, as we see these troops that are getting huge money compensations for being sent to the front lines. And yes, because of that, they are replenishing their rates, and they are using the tactic of the scorched earth. They destroy the villages and towns and then take up the ruins, which is
Yeah,
unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that may be. I mean, the Russians may be prepared to continue this, but here's some of the problems that I think they do face. Is one is at some point the casualties may reach a point where the Russians just say, "We're not prepared to pay this price." This quote special military operation, is now going 3 years plus, and it's no longer worth the cost. But to the extent that they bring more people in, they're going to tax their economy. Right now, I think the Russians say that their unemployment rate is below 2% because they're mobilizing people for defense industries. Well, in order to attract labor, a lot of industries now having to pay higher wages. That's a big contributor to the 9% inflation rate in Russia. But at some point, if they're bringing more people in the military, they're going to undermine their ability to keep the economy going. So even if the Russian people are prepared to continue to sustain this awful human cost in terms of losing their sons and their brothers and their fathers fighting a pointless war of aggression, at some point it begins to really increase the strain on the Russian economy. So those are the sorts of things that I look at. Unfortunately for Ukraine, is those effects take time to kick in. So they're probably not going to bring a quick change to the Russian approach.
Yes, and as we were speaking, I have reminded myself of an idea which was voiced in President Zelensky's victory plan for Ukraine for the new United States administration under President Trump is the use of Ukrainian resources and the concessions in Donbass after the war. Yes, like rebuilding the region, rebuilding the territory with the help of direct United States funding, and then the extraction and use uh, of these goods jointly with the United States, NATO countries, European Union, and Ukraine. What do you think about this idea? Because what I hear most often is that Russia fights for Donbass and for Ukraine because of the resources, the natural resources of the region, which are huge.
Yeah, no, that seems to me a very logical approach for President Zelensky to make to President-elect Trump. That may have some impact on his thinking. Again, what I'm going to try to do, to the extent I mean, I don't have any in with the Trump administration, but to try to point out in writings, interviews, that if Ukraine loses, that's of course a loss for Ukraine, but that's a huge loss, I think, for the United States. And if that occurs while President Trump is in office, it will be a huge loss and even a humiliation to him. And I think he already maybe it should notice that even though I think if you look in the last 4 or 5 months, people close to Mr. Trump have floated ideas. They've talked about Ukraine accepting some loss of territory. They've talked about Ukraine accepting neutrality. Those ideas as perhaps the basis for a settlement. I look at those ideas and say, why would those ideas be of interest to Ukraine? I mean, if you are a deal maker, as Mr. Trump claims to be, and you want to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine, there have to be elements of the deal that will have appeal and attraction in Kyiv. But set that point aside, even based on what he's talked about, a proposal that looks to me as very Moscow friendly, the Russians are rejecting it even before he's become president. And I hope that Mr. Trump is noticing that. Maybe that will begin to bring him to understand just what he's dealing with. If he thinks that he can work with Ukraine and somehow broker a solution with Moscow, it's going to be, I think, much harder than he understands.
So you're talking to me that taking the even Moscow-friendly deal and rejecting it is a strike, a moral strike against the new administration and the president-elect himself, which can, in possibility, make him reconsider the deal itself and make possibly an ultimatum, the language of power that Moscow only understands.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you'd go to an ultimatum, but I certainly would hope that it would make him reconsider the possibility of negotiating a settlement with Moscow, where again, terms have been put down, but not by Mr. Trump himself, but by people close to him. I have in mind, for example, an article written by his son and his nominee to be Secretary of Health, Robert Kennedy Jr., which talked about neutrality and ceding some land. That Russia seems to say that's not enough. So I hope that begins to communicate to Mr. Trump, or at least people around him, that Russia has big ambitions, and the kind of demands that they would make would really amount to Ukrainian capitulation. And I would hope that Mr. Trump would not want to be the part of a negotiation, the result of which was not a settlement that would be acceptable to Ukraine, but would amount to a Ukrainian capitulation. That will not be good for any kind of legacy he leaves behind.
Yes, and what we are hearing that the Biden administration legacy is not so shiny and rosy in the speeches of Mr. Trump. And let us hope that this whole situation goes the most positive way for us, for us all. I mean, the Ukrainian state, the United States, and European, and the international world-based, rules-based order, because it has been shattered by this aggression since 2022, with all these rogue states and the axis of evil countries, as we call them, rising their heads and trying to destabilize the world even more. Maybe you have some insights or remarks that you would like to tell me, the audience, from yourself, your perspective, what you would like to tell us.
Well, two comments. One is, no, first, I agree. It seems to me that above and beyond Ukraine's interest, America has an important interest in Ukraine's success. If Ukraine loses, or if there's a peace that amounts to a Ukrainian capitulation, you then have an emboldened Vladimir Putin, and after several years to rebuild his military, do his ambitions end in Ukraine? I'm not sure they do. And I think that kind of Russia, that kind of Vladimir Putin, is going to be a much greater threat to Europe and American interests. So it seems to me that the place to stop Putin is in Ukraine, by helping Ukraine win, and then that contains the Russian threat to Europe. That is, I think, at this point, really important for a stable and secure Europe, which, as I said, has been a vital national interest of the United States going back for more than 70 or 75 years. So I hope that is understood by the president. And I guess my last comment is I hope 2025 is a year where Ukraine does achieve peace. But when I talk about peace, I have in mind a peace that either has the Russians completely out of Ukraine, or is a settlement on terms that Ukraine's government and Ukraine's people can accept. That's the kind of peace to me that would make sense, that I think would be good for Ukraine, but would also be good for Europe and for American interests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pifer. I'll just remind that Mr. Pifer was the third United States ambassador to the independent Ukraine, and he was today with me discussing these interesting and quite important topics. Thank you very much for your time and for your support for our security and for your security. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.